Hey everyone, in the video today I want to talk about lenses for landscape photography. Without a doubt, this is the most common question I'm asked. What is my favorite lens, or what lens do I recommend? So in this video I'm going to break down the 3 lenses that I like to use. I'll run through some of the pros and cons for each. We'll use them out here in the landscape, and you can also download the raw files of these shots via the link below. Alright, let's have a look. So when it comes to photography and the way that I approach the landscape, there's a few factors that I have in mind. Mainly, I don't want to be restricted in any way creatively. And what I mean by that is, if I can see something in the landscape or envision some kind of image, I don't want to be let down by my gear and not being able to compose that with my lenses. So for that reason, I cover a pretty big range in focal lengths. I go from 12mm on the widest end, so I've got a 12 to 24mm lens, and then on the extreme end I've got a 100 to 400mm telephoto lens, and then in the middle I've got a mid-range zoom, a 28 to 75mm. This is the Tamron one, the other two are Sony. So in theory I'm able to go from 12mm right to 400, and even for the 100 to 400 I have a 2x converter, which is going to allow me to change that lens from 100 to 400 to 200 to 800. Now I'm going to go into the reasons why I use these lenses, and then we'll have a look at the application for each one. So the first lens that we're going to look at is the long lens, the 100 to 400mm. Now one of the common questions I get is, do I use primes? Do I suggest using prime lenses? Obviously I don't, as you can see. The main reason really is it's just more versatile for me to have a zoom lens. I don't really like restricting things too much in the field. And also the weight, the zoom lenses are significantly lighter than the primes. Sometimes I could be out for multiple days, could be hiking. I just want to have the lightest gear possible, but also maintain that sharpness as well. So that's why I like to just use these zooms. Now, when it comes to the 100 to 400mm, what this lens is great for, obviously, is capturing things far off in the distance. This is my lens that I'm using for my mountain scenes where I might have some atmosphere surrounding the peaks. Sometimes it could be a forest scene with something far away, but it's all those smaller details, it's almost what I call the scene within the scene. All of these lenses I use almost equally, to be honest. And if I removed one from my kit, I would definitely, have a void there to be filled. So it's hard for me to narrow down that one lens in particular, because they all have a specific purpose in my workflow in the way that I like to photograph the landscape. So if we're going to pull up now and do a shot on the 100 to 400mm, I'm obviously not worried too much about what's immediately in front of me, although it can be used for that purpose too, and we can have a look at that later. But I'm usually looking out in the distance, and at the moment we've got a mountain scene in the background. So I start to analyze the peaks and the way that the light is interacting with the landscape. So let's do a shot now with the 100 to 400. And don't forget to download these raw files, and you can check out the clarity of the lens. This framing here is at 100mm, and it's pulling in the background quite nicely, but you'll see the benefit of the lens as we start to pull things in, the difference it makes and the way that it can interpret the landscape. It can really dramatize and emphasize things a lot more. It's because it compresses the scene. And this is the type of framing I'd be looking at, getting a peak with a little bit of cloud and atmosphere. Typically, I probably wouldn't use this lens on such a clear day. It's great for, atmospheric conditions. But regardless, it allows me to simplify the scene, not getting too much sky, hardly any foreground. And, on a day like today with these mountains, it's all about shape, the lines, the way the lines lead the eye through the frame. So this is something I'd probably photograph if I was out using this lens now. And I use it a lot, and it's one of those ones that it's hard to plan for these shots, because the atmosphere and the light does play a major role in the images I like to create with this lens. Honestly, I have pretty much no complaints about this lens. One of the more common telephoto lenses is the 70 to 200. So I used to have one of those, but once I started shooting with the 100 to 400mm, you really get used to having that extra reach. And when you go back to a 70 to 200, it almost feels like a wide angle. So for me, this lens, the Sony version, the Canon version I've also used, they're sharp enough, they're really sharp actually. And it's just so handy being able to really zoom in and compress all that's going on in the background. Some people ask about with the 2x converter and being more around the 600 to 800 mil, how the quality is of the lens. The main consideration there, and even just without the converter at 300 to 400, it does come down to your conditions. And sometimes if you have a day where there could be high humidity or there could be a bit of mist and atmosphere in the background, you'll get soft images. And it's actually nothing to do with the optics. It's just that you're compressing through a lot of moisture in the air, moisture that the eye may not even be able to see. So I have had images in the past where I just could not get them sharp, and that was the reason why. And then on a clearer day, no problem at all. And that's just due to that heavy compression, what you're zooming through, you know, that moisture in the atmosphere. So it is a consideration, but I definitely don't have any complaints. So let's look at the mid-range now and the type of framing that I would do using the mid-range zoom lens. So I'm throwing on the Tamron 28 to 75 mil now, mid-range zoom. Typically what I like to use this for is those scenes that, you know, I'm not trying to capture the whole grand landscape necessarily, and I'm not zooming in the background. It's more for that, you know, mid-level perspective, somewhat similar to how the human eye sees the landscape. Typically I'd say, you know, it's just what's off in the distance and removing that foreground matter. For the environment here, you know, we've got a very calm lake in front of me. There's lots of blue down in the lake and there's lots of blue in this clear sky above. I really don't want to capture that. That's why the long lens was great. What I would use this for in this type of landscape would be to add something in the mid-level, that mid-ground area. So we might go change location now, and I'll show you how these types of focal lengths can be incredibly handy in creating a sense of depth and a nice realistic perspective on the landscape itself. Now I've got a perspective here where we have some trees and some ferns, just a different combination of bush with the lake and then the mountains in the back. So we've got multiple layers here, which is how you create a good sense of depth. And this lens I find is perfect for this type of scenery because it's allowing us to still capture the grand landscape, but we're not going too wide that the size of the mountains is just, it suffers from the pincushion effect and it's getting too small. And then of course we're not zooming in so far that we're cutting out all of this beautiful mid-ground subject matter. Just looking through the lens now, this is on the wider range of things, 28 mil, but you'll see here as I start to pull in, getting closer to 50 mil, 75, and it's allowing me to get those mountains looking more impressive, a little bit closer to how the eye would see them, but still incorporating something in the foreground and then of course the mid-ground. And if I turn over where we have a touch more light, you'll see now we've got a beautiful light in the background, the light on the water, and then in the front the trees. So just multiple layers there. And looking through the lens, it's just a matter of finding that right balance on the focal length. I typically don't want too much sky as well, I find it quite distracting. But you can see how handy this lens is to be able to capture this type of scenery, particularly when you have the mountains a little bit further away. The wide angle really is not the best lens choice. And sometimes the long lens won't be either. This way you're getting the environment in as well as what's going on in the background, as well as a little bit of sky, especially if you actually had some cloud up there and a nice sunset going on, for example. Another really practical thing to do with the mid-range zoom is to look at those intimate scenes in nature. So not really worried about capturing the sky and the grand landscape, but either looking straight down at the ground, or in this case, just looking into the bracken fern here. And this is where you can just create those nice intimate images that are all about texture, shape, color, and those finer details. So if I was going to shoot this here, not that this is probably the best example, but it will be good enough for today. You'll get the idea, but it's just a nice way to be able to simplify the scene and take in all those little details. One of the common questions, I guess, is what would be the one lens I would use? And it's a real tricky one to answer because, like I said, I feel like I use all three almost evenly and I really rely on them all. But if you had to buy one lens, because I know it's, you know, it's not cheap, I'd probably say go for the mid-range zoom. I just think it's so handy. So whether that's a 24 to 70, in this case it's a 28 to 75, I find that's really going to allow you to get a good variety of different scenes. And then from there you could specialize in getting more of an ultra wide or going for the longer telephoto lens. Now in regards to using the Tamron here, whether it's Tamron, Sigma, there's a few third-party brands out there. They make great glass and you'll find that the price point is significantly less than the big camera models themselves. So it's something to consider. like I said, I'm real happy with this, the Tamron 28-75. There's even a 28-200. Super practical lenses, and I use them a lot for aerial photography as well. Last lens we're going to look at now is the ultra wide. Typically on a full frame lens, you'd probably find the 16-35 is the most common ultra wide lens. That's something that I've used for years. I've recently picked up the Sony 12-24, so just getting that extra bit of width there. This lens, like, to be honest, it is probably the more popular lens, not necessarily the 12-24, but just ultra wides in general in landscape photography, because it's allowing us to just capture so much of the scenery, and we can get a lot of depth. We're able to capture something immediately in front of us as well as everything in the background. I'd say for me that this lens, you know, the ultra wide does probably take up a little bit more in the portfolio compared to the other two lenses. For that very reason, it's just such a nice way to encompass the whole scene. In our scenery here today, what I would use this lens for is to accentuate the foreground details. That's what it's all about. It's about being able to get ultra close to something, create that sense of depth, showcase all the textures, but we're still getting that background in. One of the problems though is, particularly when you're far away from the mountains, is something called the pin cushion effect. So with the curvature of the lens, anything that's going to be towards that center is going to really look like it's getting pushed further away. And when it comes to mountains, they look a lot smaller. So we'll do a few frames here. You'll be surprised how close you can actually get to that foreground subject matter. This is the one thing that I see people sometimes underutilize. They'll have the wide on, but then they'll still stand further back. And when you do that, it's kind of defeating the point of having the lens on in the first place. The whole point is to be able to get in ultra close there, because you use the distortion to your advantage. The way that it distorts things can actually help lead the eye through the frame. So if I was going to frame up here, I love the way that these ferns are kind of curving inwards, and it helps the eye just flow through the scene. But definitely one of the downsides from where I am now is that those mountains in the back are just so tiny. And if I was going to be shooting here, you know, I'd be keeping in mind that the mountains are not necessarily the main subject matter anymore. It's more or less the foreground and the midground, with the background mountains just being a little complement to the scene. So I'll pull these up and you'll see the difference in how close you can actually get. Big depth of field now, so I've closed down the f-stop a lot to f16. But to make the mountains stand out more in the frame, we might want to simplify the foreground and get a little bit closer. So let's head down to the water's edge. We'll get a couple of final shots and then we'll wrap up. So we've come down the lakefront now. The whole point really is to just get a little bit closer to those mountains and also simplify the midground. Up there, some of the trees admittedly were getting in the way of the frame. So down here now we've got the open vista with the lake. But again, like I said, the whole point of the wide angle is to be able to incorporate some kind of foreground to, you know, lead the eye and create that sense of depth. So we're going to do the old classic rocks on the water's edge. There's a few out here, so let's have a look. We'll find a bit of a natural frame and we'll see how the wide angle can be used to capture this type of environment. What I look for when I'm using something like rocks, for example, or just in general, I like to have balance. So if I'm going to have a rock on my left, I really want one on the right as well. Otherwise I'm creating a bit of a negative space and something that could be a distraction. As we have right here, I've got a rock on the right, a rock on the left, so that's going to give me that balance and also a natural frame for the eye to flow through into that background. So we'll have a look now and see how it can be viewed and composed using the wider perspective. And it's just vastly different to any of the shots that we got earlier on. Now the key I find with the wide angle and a composition like this really is tilting down a touch. What that will do is help get a bit more stretch on those mountains, so the pin cushion effect is not really you know, compressing those in and they don't look too small. But also it will mean that the eye will naturally begin in the lower portion and flow through. If you did the opposite and tilt it up, the eye will be drawn to the sky, and there's obviously, in this case, there's nothing up there, so the eye is not flowing the direction I want it to. I want people to go through the scene. So for that reason, I'll tilt down just a little bit and get my horizon line above the halfway point. I don't want the horizon in the middle, I want it just above. So I'll get it in the center and then just do a slight tilt. I have to get a little bit closer here so I'm not picking up the sand. And you know, at the moment, probably 16 millimeters would be enough to really get this shot here. Making sure that the rocks that I'm using are a similar distance from the edge of the frame. So if one of them has a sliver of water on the side of it, I'll make sure the other one does. Or if they're both going out of the, one's going out of the frame, I'll make sure the other one is. So it's all about symmetry and balance. So we'll do a shot here. And you know, obviously today it's quite clear, so we're not getting anything too groundbreaking. Let's try and see if there's another little cluster of rocks we can use just to make a slightly better composition. So I've just walked a little bit further down and I've got a similar thing. I've got a rock on the right, a rock on the left, but this time there's also a few stones here in the lower portion. And what that's doing is it's creating a nice natural frame that goes all the way around. And that way with my wide angle, I'm able to pick all of that up, and then the eye, I'm hoping, will flow through into the background. One of the big considerations is your height. So with the wide angle, when you're getting down low like I am, separation is key. You want to make sure that whatever you've got here in the foreground is not cutting off the midground and then hitting the background. So if I get too low, these stones are going to come up, go above the horizon line, and now there's that loss of depth. There's no sense of depth there. So I'm making sure that I've got foreground, then a line of midground, which is our water, and even a few more stones out there, and then the background with the mountains. And like I said earlier, just getting that horizon line up slightly so the eye intuitively will flow from the foreground through into that background. And another important factor which we have going on for us is we've got that glow of light in the back. The eye is drawn to light, so we're going from a darker frame towards the light there, dark to light. So the eye will transition from the front here into the background. And I think it's actually not a bad little scene, considering we don't have any cloud or anything too crazy happening with our sunset. I think this is nice anyway, nonetheless. All right guys, so as I said at the start, pretty hard for me to narrow down one favorite lens. I really use all three equally. If you could only choose one for yourself, if you're just getting into photography, maybe consider the mid-range zoom. But otherwise, you can see that each one really does play its own individual role when it comes to capturing the landscape. Don't forget to check out that link below to download the raw files, and at least you can see firsthand how each of these operate. Thanks for checking out the video. Don't forget to leave a comment below as well. I'm more than happy to get back to you. Thanks for viewing, and I'll see you in the next one.